Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Ask the Doctor. Tonight, we are going to learn about preparing for pregnancy in 2023. So make sure that you take notes, and if there's somebody that can use this information, there are ways for you to access this later on as well. The man of the hour teaches, trains, and lectures doctors all over the world, has taught over $10,000 in educational seminars to these people. He is a wonderful mentor, a friend, a family man, clinical practice over 30 years. Give it up for Dr. Bob Rakowski.
Well, Carol, thank you always for the beautiful intro. I have to say that this certainly is one of my favorite topics and one of the more timely ones. Yeah, I think of the couples that I've worked with over the years that now have healthy, amazing babies. You know, they are absolutely our greatest gift. And you know what? The world is struggling. So maybe we have some solutions that can help move people forward. Yeah, as you mentioned, 3+ decades in clinical practice, seeing all ends of the spectrum. So I've seen the elite, I've seen those that were sent home to die, and everything in between. And, you know, sometimes it's a mystery. Why aren't couples having more babies? Well, maybe we can answer some of those questions today. This is a generalized topic outline that I'm going to go through. We're going to talk about a lot of things, actually starting with the link between sexual health and longevity. If you've seen Mind Valley Talks, you probably know that they have really good quality speakers with cutting edge information. And this doctor's name is Amy Killen. And she was talking about essentially sexual health as not really a luxury, but of one of the pillars of life that leads to better longevity. So here's what the peer-reviewed medical literature says. Overall, participants with higher levels of sexual activity had decreased risk of all-cause death. Now, you might start thinking about that. Is it sex is good for you, or is this more a representation that if you're healthy enough and have a low enough stress life to have a healthy love life, sex life, then probably you're going to live longer. And I think it actually goes both ways. You know, there's something magic about human connection, but let's face it, you need to be healthy and in a fairly low stress circumstance to have a healthy love life. So we're going to talk about the 3 of the 4 things that she talked about. She's number 1, take care of your body. That's a really good idea. And in fact, no matter what is ailing you or whatever you're trying to prevent, that's going to be a real good strategy. She had a whole section of her talk on nitric oxide, that wonderful miracle molecule. We'll talk about that too. We'll talk about optimizing hormones. And this is something that I think is a two-edged sword. You know, I literally see people, they're tested low hormones, and doctors, first and foremost, give them hormones without really trying to figure out what's going on with them. You know, and I've already seen a 16-year-old male told that he needed testosterone replacement for the rest of his life. And then 6 months on a good program, you know, we got him a really elite testosterone level. And by the way, now he's a happy father, right, with a beautiful family. Stem cells we won't really talk about, or these other specific therapies for sexual dysfunction, but you've probably heard me talk about the Magnificent 7. We've got to eat right, drink right, think right, move right, sleep right, poop right, talk right every single day. And, you know, I'm listening to a new audiobook by Tony Robbins. And you know, Tony's certainly a business guru, a strategy guru, but he's also a very good resource collector and someone who partners with really good people. And they're actually saying that the number 1 theory of aging is that the cells lose their ability to accurately communicate with one another. So when we start talking about talking right, we're not just talking about the conversation you have in your head or with others, but literally every single cell talking to one another. And by the way, every factor of health is going to impact cell-to-cell communication. So we start talking about nitric oxide. You know, I was at the conference where the Nobel Prize-winning researcher Farhad Murad over 30 years ago started sharing the magic of nitric oxide. And they figured, wow, this is really important. And time has shown that this may be the second most important molecule in all of human physiology, second only to oxygen. So it's going to help you get a healthy heart and circulatory system. It's going to help with all of your central nervous system transmission. It's critical for the immune system, and then sexual function for both men and women, or lack of it, could lead to sexual dysfunction. So you start looking, and we have related nitric oxide to sexual function now for over 30 years and nearly 1,000 published studies, and that number keeps increasing. So nitric oxide, I'm going to look at the picture to the right. It's going to be very, very critical for all of the circulatory system, the lungs. And in fact, one of the things they figured out with the virus that was somewhat of a problem over the last couple of years, if individuals had good nitric oxide status, they were very unlikely to have any type of serious respiratory problems with the virus. When we start talking about cell proliferation, that's going to be growth of new cells and the expansion of existing ones, great for the immune system, for both the central and the peripheral nervous system, the gut, and finally, sexual health. So you start looking at that and you come to realize, okay, this molecule is really, really important. So maybe I want to go the extra mile to optimize it. So when they came up with Viagra, they knew that nitric oxide was very, very critical for sexual function in men. But then somewhere down the road, they figured out, wait a minute, women need this just as much as men do. So nearly 100 published medical studies on nitric oxide and sexual function within women. So what does this miracle molecule do? A single dose can dilate blood vessels by as much as 62%. So if you have a tissue that's struggling for oxygen, this is a sure way to get better oxygen delivery. Now, without getting too technical, we have multiple forms of nitric oxide, and one is the inflammatory form of nitric oxide. And here's what we tell people. If you have an excessive amount of inflammation, you are going to dramatically deplete nitric oxide throughout the entire body, and that will create problems, but especially for the cardiovascular system. So since I learn with pictures, I also teach with pictures, and this is a picture of a python swallowing a sheep. And my simple catchphrase that's very, very accurate is that inflammation devours nitric oxide. In fact, in an acute inflammatory episode, you can increase this amount of inflammatory destructive nitric oxide by 1,000x. There was an article about the major things that are causing chronic illness on the planet to the tune of over $30 trillion a year. And when you look in the middle of all this problem, this SCI stands for systemic chronic inflammation. Ultimately, what that's going to do is lead to all these horrible things like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, depression, autoimmune circumstances, neurodegeneration, muscle loss, bone loss, immune loss. And all of that is triggered by depletion of nitric oxide, which if we go and we break down the causes, these do fall into the deadly quartet: stress, toxins, malnutrition, and physical inactivity. So when you start looking at all the things that are going on, you come to realize that, you know what, if we just took better care of ourselves, had more consciousness and more proactivity, we could probably prevent a big chunk of the things that are dragging down the world. I'm always going to give a plug for Ganoderma, and we'll find out that this is a profound nitric oxide regulator, but it's also anti-inflammatory by over a dozen different mechanisms. When they discovered nitric oxide, they thought, okay, how does the body make nitric oxide? And they actually make it from an amino acid called arginine. But it's fairly complex, and there are a number of nutrient cofactors and things like stress and inflammation get in the way of the body making nitric oxide. Then later on, they figured out, okay, there's another way to get nitric oxide. So they take nitrate-rich plants, and nitrate can be reduced to nitrite, which can be reduced to nitric oxide. And my very practical teaching statement is, what do you think is easier, to build a building or to tear it down? And so if we go to the tragedy of 9/11 in the World Trade Center, it took, who knows, a decade to build these amazing towers, but less than a few hours to tear them down. So clearly building is more challenging than breaking down. So we want to make sure we get a lot of plant-rich nitrates in our diet. And Ganoderma, again, guess what? A powerful source of nitrate, but also a wonderful regulator of nitric oxide. When we start talking about stress and sexual function and sexual health and even reproduction, Dr. Ruth was pretty famous in that she would say, you know what, the most important sex organ is the one between your ears. So, you want that headspace to be right. You want to be in a low stress circumstance, a nice loving circumstance. And that's a great environment to work on procreating. When you look at what we're learning about how much of the brain is involved in human sexual behavior, it's not so simple as just being a simple hormone or a molecule. Literally, nearly the whole brain is involved with this. And, think about that for a moment. Probably the most important thing that we can do as humans is reproduce, right? So if we don't reproduce, what happens to our future? It's gone. But if we can reproduce in a healthy way, well, then we propagate the species and hopefully the good that we're going to do in the planet. So this is a slide that I copied. So I actually screenshot it from a neurochemistry lecture on sexual function. And you start looking, and again, plenty of molecules involved there, but I'm going to transition to what's called the flow state. Now, there's the Human Flow Institute. There's a neurophysiologic researcher that wrote a book called Flow. And ultimately, this is where life just flies by. Time just moves so fast. You're in the moment, you're enjoying it, and hours have passed, and it doesn't even feel like a few moments. Now, I don't know that I'd be in flow state hanging from the edge of a cliff, but these climbers are, and that's probably why they keep going back. But you'll notice there's a huge crossover between sexual function and flow state. And I like to tell people that love is a biohack for flow state. And by the way, love is a biohack for sexual dysfunction as well. So endorphins wasn't part of libido, but that's the natural painkiller. And then anandamide, this is actually what they call the bliss molecule. Now, I also find it fascinating that anandamide is actually found in chocolate. So if you think about chocolate as a gift for a lover, well, maybe there's something to that. Maybe that starts creating that neurochemistry where people are maybe feeling, a little more frisky, let's just say. And so anandamide and chocolate, really, really good for overall well-being. And there's a picture of it, not that you need to picture the backbone of the molecule, but the good name of it is the bliss molecule. And maybe that's part of the reason why people enjoy chocolate as much as they do. When we start talking about stress, this is a very powerful statement, and it's very accurate. You're either making stress hormones or sex hormones. So this doctor, Sarah Ballantyne, had this really nice drawing. So I copied it and give her credit for it. But when we start looking at this chronic stress hormone, cortisol, it inhibits something called gonadotropin releasing hormone. And that is how the hypothalamus tells the pituitary to release these two molecules, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, which, if we're talking about female physiology, that helps the ovaries to develop an egg, rupture the egg, have the egg ready for fertilization. And it also helps the body to produce estrogens and progestins. Now, males also have luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. In that case, it helps the male to make testosterone and sperm. So stress for both genders will definitely lead to disruption of sexual chemistry and sexual function. So when you start looking at sexual dysfunction and low libido, it turns out that about 15% of males suffer with low libido and 33% of females. So 1 in 3. Now, we're definitely wired differently, but if we only look at hormones, we come to realize that you need the right balance of cortisol, testosterone, estrogen, DHEA, thyroid hormone, oxytocin, and vasopressin. So, plenty of things there. So is it just testosterone? No. Is it just estrogen? No. It's a blend of a lot of different things, including a healthy nervous system, good levels of nitric oxide, overall body balance, etc. When we start looking at treatments for low female libido, I'm going to be on the left side of this chart. I like to promote healthy lifestyle. I certainly am a big fan of natural supplements. Now, if needed, if we need medication, the guidelines are clear. You want to use the lowest dose for the shortest duration. And you know what, that's been published for a long, long time, but I don't see as a society that we actually follow that. And I've seen plenty of people put on hormones and they feel like they get an instant boost, like they feel better than they have in a long, long time. But when the body adapts to that new level, guess what? They don't feel good anymore because they didn't address cause and effect. And those higher levels of hormones actually come with risk, including hormone-related cancers. So estrogen and testosterone, both very important for female sexual desire. And there are doctors that consistently put women on both. Now, there's certainly a downside to too much and or too little testosterone. But where do females get it from? Some is made in the ovaries, more is made in the adrenal glands, but the majority of it is actually made in the peripheral tissues, the tissues of the body that need it. And that term is called intracrinology. And the precursor to that is actually something called DHEA. So when the body is under a low stress circumstance, DHEA can go make the estrogens, the progestins, and the androgens. But when someone's under a fair amount of stress, this pathway is driven and cortisol is made at the expense of DHEA and the sex steroids. So we want to keep stress under control. You start looking at low testosterone, there's a number of challenges since we're talking about sexual function, low libido, but also post-menopause, people can fall apart faster, loss of muscle, loss of bone, and they even associate it with bladder incontinence. Now, high testosterone, when we're in our childbearing years, PCOS is actually a cause of too many androgens. And so what happens is that the ovary, instead of making progestins and estrogens, it makes androgens, and that can create hair growth where we don't want it. That's called hirsutism, and that can cause acne. By the way, it can even cause loss of hair on the head. When there's too many androgens in the fetus, there are a number of problems, including the differentiation of the brain and the brain's ability to connect both sides. And some have suggested that autism is an extreme of the male brain and too much androgen influence. And then after menopause, too much testosterone, insulin resistance, and higher levels of heart risk. I just downloaded this straight from Mayo Clinic. When should you see a doctor? Well, the solution can be as simple as changing medication. So often what people don't realize, especially things like antidepressants, are associated with loss of libido and altered sexual function. Things like statins, things that are used fairly common, they can disrupt the hormones and also cause a disruption in libido. A natural remedy that so many people like is this supreme version of organo coffee. And I'll just show you quickly, not only does it have the Ganoderma, which is great for nitric oxide, over 100 studies, ginseng, nearly 70 studies on sexual function, this herb called Longifolia jack, 10 studies on it and sexual function, and then maca. All four of those are in there. And here's what we know. When people have some challenges and they reach for this, I think it's the majority of people that I've shared this with have said, you know what, that did the trick. I am feeling better again. So the Ganoderma can help improve the health, and all this synergistic herbs in there are phenomenal for sexual function. Someone sent in a question about sex education for youngsters. And you know what, I think that was a really awkward time of life with me too, when I was talking to my kids, but I addressed it from a biologic point of view. And this was a really nice YouTube video talking about the reproductive system physiology. And when you take it as biology and as a matter of what it really is, how we're made and how our bodies work, maybe some of the forbidden nature of the topic can be bypassed. So if you have an easy time talking to your kids about this, good. If you don't have an easy time, welcome to the club. But I think we do need to talk, especially to keep our kids safe. Really good strategy there. So now let's look at the overall declining birth rate. This is statistics on the US. And, you start looking, 2007, there's been a very consistent decline in birth rate. And you might ask, why is that possible? And by the way, we would almost think that, with lockdowns and things like that and people having more time at home, we might expect a baby boom. But that certainly did not happen. So I wonder if that's just a sign that the population is not very healthy. But 10% of women in the world are estimated to be infertile. And then when you start looking at couples, nearly 16%, or basically 1 in 6. When we start looking at symptoms, the primary symptom is really the inability to get pregnant. Now, could that be associated with abnormal periods? It certainly could be. Whether they're too long in between, too short a time in between, too heavy, too light, these are all things that can make a difference. And by the way, painful periods, that's certainly a sign of imbalance. And what I would suggest is mostly estrogen toxicity. And most of the time, when we put women on a really good estrogen detox, we reduce that pain dramatically, and usually within 2 cycles, within about 60 days. And so, this is one thing that we do have good success with. We're going to find out that obesity disrupts fertility in both men and women. So this reference here talks about longer conception time if they're able to conceive at all, overall much lower fertility rate, and a higher rate of miscarriage. And you might ask, well, what's the link there? Well, obesity is extremely inflammatory, and that disrupts a lot of things, including nitric oxide. It also is something that's powerful for insulin resistance, and that's going to disrupt the ovarian hormone production, but it also damages cells. They call them advanced glycosylated end products. The acronym is AGE. And when you have more of those, higher blood sugar, you will age faster. Pretty technical slide, because I do use these to teach doctors as well. But you start looking at all the things that can happen from fat cells that are too large. And it's a significant disruption of overall health and wellness, including fertility. And then you start looking at the other systems of the body that can have a problem: the liver, the kidneys, the brain. All this is a problem with excess body fat. We're going to transition to the decline in males on the globe now. Since 1970, and in some countries since 1950, there has been a consistent decline in the number of males born. So here's what we know. There are over 1,000 chemicals in the environment with proven hormone disrupting properties, endocrine disrupting properties. And notice what they list: pesticides, fungicides. So we want to eat organic food, industrial chemicals, plasticizers. I see more and more people, drinking out of glass bottles, and that's a good thing, or at least non-plastic bottles. Nonylphenol, bisphenol, heavy metals, different types of pharmaceuticals, and they even throw in phytoestrogens, which, by the way, you'd have to get a ton of plant-based estrogens to disrupt your overall wellness. And there's plenty of good data that phytoestrogens are actually a very, very healthy part of the diet for the vast majority of people. There may be a small percentage that don't do well with them. So since it's estrogens that are the biggest poison to the endocrine system in our society and in our environment, what we know is that males are much more disrupted by these estrogens. And so the theory is this can lead to maldevelopment, miscarriage, or if the child is born, then they may have fertility problems throughout their life and be more vulnerable to hormone-related cancers. And this is a picture it shows of common endocrine disrupting chemicals that pregnant women are consistently exposed to. I want you to think about that for a moment. We've got these parabens that are in skincare products, heavy metals that are everywhere, PCBs and other things like that. But extreme disruption. So one of the things that I've said for years is we really want to take care of our moms to be, and even before they're pregnant, get them a really clean body by doing detox, get them a clean environment by detoxing their home, and teach them the importance of things like organic food and supplements. And now they didn't study this in human males because it'd be a crime against humanity to give males estrogens. But they found out when studying fish populations that the male fish are much more disrupted by these estrogen type chemicals. This was a graph of male birth rate from a tribe called the Amjinang that, by the way, are in Canada. And, they were cooking along with a higher than 50% male birth rate until they built a series of petrochemical factories around them. And then the male birth rate just dropped off exponentially. So we start looking at infertility. Again, it's 15% of couples, which is about 1 in 7. And then you start looking, 50% of the time it's a female, 30% of the time it's the males, 20% it's actually both. And so we do want to, create both healthy moms and healthy dads to have healthy babies. And you look at this time period from 1973 to 2011, 59% reduction in male sperm. So, and the last time I saw the update was 2011, and I could just about guarantee you it's probably worse now in 2023. They've also shown that as the global production of plastics increased, sperm count dropped on a nearly inverse ratio. And what about obesity? It's not good for female fertility. It is not good for male fertility. And so if they do get pregnant, notice what it says, epigenetic modifications to the offspring. That means that the child will be more prone to illness because of having 1 or 2 obese parents. This one shows a lot of different things that happen with obesity, including sexual dysfunction. But one of the things that we know is that the testicles need a cooler environment to ideally make sperm. And so, there have been men that just by changing essentially the type of underwear that they wear, I almost said by changing their underwear, I hope they do that on a consistent basis, like daily, right? But changing from briefs to boxers can help some men become fertile. And interesting graphic, when this happens, when males become obese, then pregnancy is not likely to happen. So there's so many things that happen in again, both men and women, where obesity moves them towards a lesser state of health. And here they quantified it. They said for every 9 kilograms or 20 pounds, fertility will decrease 10%. So it's almost 1% per kilogram of body weight. So different other things that happen, we can go from the head all the way down and find out that, again, too much body fat is a big negative for health, fertility, and longevity. Finally, a comment on the deadly quartet, because I always like to tie in what I consider the main theme: stress, toxins, malnutrition, physical inactivity. Malnutrition, top cause of death on the planet. And when you have malnutrition, you're much less likely to reproduce. And interestingly enough, this PubMed said, you know what, you want a healthy diet. That's true. For women, they recommended folic acid and omega-3s. I'm going to go beyond that. I think they need a comprehensive multivitamin, multiminerals, superfoods, all organic diet, things like that. Men, they're recommending just antioxidants. But again, I think we want to be a lot more comprehensive in our nutrition recommendations. This was a rat study because we wouldn't do this to humans, but they took pregnant rat mothers and they put them on an omega-3 deficient diet. And in a single reproductive cycle, the brain basically shrunk by 21%. And people might ask, could this be a factor in postpartum depression? Well, I think there's very little doubt that it is. And in fact, there's plenty of studies that show just omega-3s alone can be a very good strategy to reduce depression. When we start looking at stress, remember that simple statement. You're either making sex hormones and so again, stress hormones or sex hormones. And a very powerful statement here: the worst disruptors of the hormonal systems in our society, pesticides are at the very near top. Bisphenol A's, herbicides, heavy metals, these things are universal in the environment and in bodies. And this was a story from 2017, but I found it pretty powerful. This killer whale washed up on shore, and when they did an autopsy, they realized that this whale had never had a calf, and they believe it was because of the endocrine-type toxins that were located in the blubber of the animal that prevented fertility. So we start looking at these chemicals. Certainly, it'll disrupt the hormones. And notice it can damage both the male and female reproductive system or even kill the developing fetus. I was asked on an earlier version of this call today, how common is miscarriage? I don't know that we really know, because the published data is most women will actually miscarry before they even know that they're pregnant. So it might be far more common than we know. And ultimately, we want healthy moms, healthy babies. Exercise is an important part of that. Can pregnant women exercise? You bet they can. Now, should they do a competitive triathlete? Probably not. Should they get their body fat down to single-digit percentage? No, because that's an endocrinologically active organ. But we want to exercise. Exercise can be really good for PCOS, and PCOS is a major cause of infertility in females. And when we look at females that over-exercise, there's not a lot of them, but they're out there. A number of years ago, University of Texas did a study of their female athletes, and they found out that 90% of them were not having menstrual cycles. So when women are training hard, when they get their body fat down low, they stop making estrogens, and that can lead to altered menstrual cycles, altered fertility, loss of muscle, loss of bone. And finally, just by way of teaching, ideal time for conception and what happens to eggs throughout the life cycle, I always like the Swedish term for ovaries, which is egg stalkers. They pronounce it egg stalkers, even though they don't spell it the same as we do. But in utero, the baby in mother's womb has somewhere between 5 and 7 million eggs. And then you look at birth, they're already down to 1 to 2 million, age 32, 120,000, 37 down to 25,000. And then 52, basically the shelf life on the eggs is shut down. And what happens then? Then the ovaries close shop. The egg stalkers are no longer open for business. When we start looking at the effect of age on female fertility, we see that it starts declining after the age of 30. And is very unlikely after the age of 40. And then you start looking at even things like IVF, and IVF is much less likely to be successful in older moms. The term intracrinology, DHEA, is converted into the hormones that the tissues need. The hormones are made there, they're utilized there, they're detoxified there. And the first time I heard of this term, the endocrinologist said, by the way, what that means, if we take postmenopausal women and we start testing their blood for hormones, we don't have a very accurate picture of what's happening. Nearly $20,000 per episode of using in vitro fertilization. And again, the success rate drops very dramatically with each passing year after the age of 35. So that leads us to questions and answers, if there are any on this beautiful night.
Well, I don't know about you guys, but I couldn't keep up with the notes tonight, so I'll definitely need to rewatch this one. This was definitely a lot of information, right? Even Claudio's nodding there. I don't have anything typed in the chat, but I'm pretty sure, Claudio, are you good to go?
I'm always ready. So I actually ran into a woman, I think last week sometime. Her daughter's having, her daughter and her husband, I guess, are having issues getting pregnant. So they're trying alternative methods. She can't be on a call tonight because she's actually working, but I'm going to send her the link. The estrogen protocol, I can't seem to find it. I know I would have actually saved that somewhere on my phone, but I can't seem to find it somewhere. I'm not sure if we can share the link possibly, or maybe get back to me on that later, please.
Yeah, it's probably somewhere on YouTube, and I can hunt that down. But here, here's what I tell people. There was a lecturer a couple decades ago. His name was Joe Collins, and he wrote a book entitled "What's Your Menopause Type?" And he made a statement. He said, estrogens, whether you make them, whether you take them, you need to get rid of them every day. Now, I tweaked that statement. I said, estrogens, whether you make them, whether you take them, whether you're knowingly or unknowingly intoxicated by them, whether you're a man, whether you're a woman, you need to get rid of them every day in a healthy way. So there's 11 different liver enzymes that start the process of estrogen detoxification. And then there's another phase where that molecule is neutralized by something called glucuronic acid sulfate or a methyl group. And so there are medical foods proven to enhance estrogen clearance, and a couple different companies have them. And what I tell people is they've done the before and afters, and what they find out is that this medical food creates fully detoxified anti-cancer healthy estrogens 950% more effectively than placebo. So this estrogen related medical food is very important. And then we fast forward, maybe it was a decade after that, they came out with this term metalloestrogens. And they found out that things like lead, cadmium, mercury, nickel, tin all have estrogen type activity. And so a heavy metal clearance can be very, very effective. And what I tell people is that there are medical chelating agents, things like EDTA, DMSA, DMPS, and they will infuse these toxins into the body. There's a couple challenges. One, these big molecules don't cross the blood-brain barrier. And they're not selective to only the toxic metals. They'll even clear out the nutritive elements as well, creating mineral deficiency. But the body makes something called metallothionein proteins. And the better you are at making metallothionein proteins, the better you will clear the toxic metals. And now let's go to our favorite superfood, Ganoderma. It will actually increase metallothionein proteins by 800%. So very powerful there.
What was your comment regarding Supreme Coffee and sexuality? Can you expound on that?
Yeah, there's a combination of 4 different herbs in the Supreme version that enhances nitric oxide, enhances libido, buffers stress, and enhances sexual function. And everything in there is safe and effective, backed up by, collectively over 100 medical resources. So, will it work for everybody? Well, probably not everybody, but it should be a healthy choice that can make a difference for a fair amount of people. That's for sure.
Okay. I feel like it increases my heart rate sometimes.
Well, I have to wonder, does regular coffee do that, or the other organo coffee? Or is there something special about that stimulatory to you?
No, maybe the ginseng in it.
It might be, and so there's ways to calm down the heart rate. So, simple amino acid in the green tea, or you just drink a green tea called theanine is very, very calming to the central nervous system. That can help to maybe calm the heart rate. You might even take a couple extra Ganoderma spore capsules, because those actually drive what's known as the parasympathetic nervous system and should slow the heart. But there's something in there that's probably pushing your body harder than we want to push it, or exciting it too much.
Yeah, I really like it, but I kind of cut back on it.
Yeah, that racing heart or increased heart rate, something is a little too stimulatory for you in that one.
I never used the whole pack at once.
Okay. Yeah, that's another thing, right? It's dose dependent. So if you take a little less, probably less effect across the board, but certainly less effect on the heart as well.
If I can add to that, Supreme, there will be a testimonial coming into the Miracle of Organo Facebook group real soon. Stay tuned.
Yeah,
Awesome.
well, we've often, used the nickname the marriage counselor, because it tends to be pretty effective. And I still remember there's one of the Organo diamonds before he joined Organo had no children, and now he has 5, and he just credits the Supreme. So
I'd like to add to that, actually. You know what? As young parents, when we had our children and they were in their teens, I can relate with Dr. Bob's comment earlier. With our high school friends, when they used to come over and visit, we used to actually have a dish at our front door, and it wasn't full of candy. It was actually full of condoms. So when our boys left the house, I'm being very serious here. We had a candy dish. When the boys left, they left with protection. So, and mom being in labor and delivery, we didn't want any other guests coming to the house. So
sex education is important, right? And often one thing that when you start talking about condoms, the advantage is they also prevent sexually transmitted diseases. They're not perfect. They don't perfectly prevent pregnancy, nor perfectly prevent STDs, but they're in the 99th percentile on both of those. All right. Well, This fertility is a great topic. You know, my daughter's within 10 days of her due date, so I'm excited to be a grandfather times 4. And, you know, I'm just blessed with healthy children and with healthy spouses and healthy grandbabies. And I want that for the entire world. You know, let's do all that we can to share this beautiful health that we have. Good night, all, and God bless.